Hi, everyone. Just a quick note before we get started. My wife is expecting to deliver our third child any day now, and with a newborn in the house, I'm expecting to take a little bit of a break. I still plan on doing the weekly newsletter and on doing some short videos on the Instagram page, but the podcast will be taking a back seat for a couple months. Any folks feeling particularly generous during this time can sign up on Patreon or give a one-time contribution to the show through PayPal or Venmo. The links to all that will be in the show notes. I'm hoping that when the podcast returns, it will be better than ever. I have a lot of ideas of my own, but I really want to hear your ideas. How can I make the next round of Chattanooga Civics episodes the best yet? Send me an email, chattanoogacivics@gmail.com, to let me know. I look forward to hearing from you. Now enjoy the show. This is Chattanooga Civics. I'm Nathan Bird. I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting the show, especially the Marks family and Stephen Culp. Well, we'll get started. Mayor Kelly, thank you for coming on the show. 2-year update, kind of figure out what's been going on and what the future looks like. So thank you for your time.
Not at all. Happy to do it. I'm again, like from prior engagements, I'm just happy that somebody is actually interested in the stuff and cares enough to ask the right questions. So thank you for coming and doing it.
Awesome. Well, I want to jump right in because I know we do have a limited schedule. Looking back at the past 2 years and looking forward to the next 2 years and maybe beyond, it seemed like the best way to frame this interview was through your own framework, the One Chattanooga plan, that was vetted by all these community members and kind of promoted as the path forward for this administration. So I'm going to be drawing pretty closely from that framework to organize these questions. So we're going to start out with providing responsive and effective local government is one of those key goals. We're going to pick off where we left off last year. You said that building a good team was both your biggest accomplishment and your biggest challenge. And at last year, you were kind of hoping that your team was kind of getting settled in and ready to go. From the outside now, 2 years in, it looks a little bit like turnover in the administration is still high, both at cabinet level positions and in less public positions like code review and enforcement. Is this type of turnover typical in local government, or is it still a challenge? And how is your administration working to ensure continuation of services in light of these challenges?
It's a multifaceted issue, as many things are, right? This one in particular, I would take some premise or some issue with the premise, right? Particularly in upper management here, that I think, turnover here gets a lot of attention, but it's in the greater scheme of the entire 2,600 people in city government, I wouldn't call it, unusual. Although in city government, you do have, particularly with an agenda as aggressive as ours, a fair amount of churn, right? And so there's some burnout. There's some fit, issues. Nobody bats 1,000, right? And I definitely reject the premise fundamentally that, hey, once you're on board, you're inside the warm, cozy arms of city government, you've just sort of got a job forever. That's definitely not the way I roll. So, but that said, it's all been pretty normal stuff, right? We haven't had any, it's not a drama-filled organization. I'm not a difficult person to work for. I would say below, the city, the mayor's office level, the good old, just workforce development issues come up, right? We've lost a lot of people in LDO because the private market lures them away. Our pay scale here is not competitive. And this is what people, I imagine we'll dive into a lot of this later in terms of, what do we pay taxes for? But again, one of the looming issues is that we're not competitive with the nonprofit sector, let alone the private sector. And so we are constantly, again, we rely on the One Chattanooga plan to recruit talent, but it's not hard for people to pick talent off because, we're not even really close to competing, particularly at the upper executive levels or, in selected areas like LDO of construction companies where they are right now. It's really easy to just get picked off. And so that is, I think, the bigger macro overarching factor here, and it continues to be an issue.
Right. Well, that's actually a really good lead in
Yeah.
to our next question. It is budget season right now.
Yep.
I don't want to get bogged down in this too long, but if you could just provide some brief highlights of this year's proposed budget and maybe talk about that piece, pay scale and things like that.
Yeah, this is not a big bells and whistles budget. This is really just a continuation of a budget based around the One Chattanooga plan. Has been said many times. If you show me your budget, I'll show you your priorities, right? And so there is no tax increase. I think that's what most people were mainly relieved to hear. But we're building on a significant reduction in homelessness. A lot of lane miles paved, a lot of potholes. I mean, again, we will get into reviewing the One Chattanooga plan, but this is kind of, again, this is just last year's budget 2.0. We've got $40 million that we pledged over 10 years for roads, which is, again, a massive increase over the prior. And I know there's still frustration around that, but we'll talk about that. The $18 million for the Walnut Street Bridge, a lot of which is federal money, which is long overdue to do. Again, public safety is a big focus. Nearly half of the budget is for CPD and CFD together. I mean, that's a big number between, again, the raises that we gave last year, we obviously have to sustain. So that's a big one. We've got 9 new firefighter positions, 5 new trucks in the budget. We've got $3 million of federal funds to support affordable housing for 400 additional new units. There's $1.6 million in the budget for new parks, including Province Park, Lynbrook, and a schoolyard pilot, which is interesting. It's kind of taking unused schoolyards, which are parks, and allowing those to be used for parks when school kids aren't there. Also, $1 million for the skate park renovation, which is, I think, a lot of people are really excited about. So, again, the responsive and effective local government piece is really the piece, as I've said, that kind of makes the rest of the stuff possible, gives us permission to do the deeper work. So a lot of the budget is really based on that seventh principle.
Right. So one thing you mentioned is there's no tax increases this year, but talking about things like increasing pay plans, introducing the STEP plan, making all these historic investments in infrastructure. How long do you think, I guess, those current tax rates can be sustained before we have to start looking at changing things around?
Well, one of the surprises of this budget year was that, frankly, we didn't think we would be quite as hemmed in as we were. But we neglected to factor in the State Board of Equalization, which essentially comes in and, frankly, prevents us from capturing the natural growth that we just experienced in the last couple of years. Again, there's an old adage Mayor Coppinger used to say all the time: you can grow or you can raise taxes. It's pretty simple. And in a tax structure like ours, which is mainly sales and property tax based, growth should take care of our issues, provided that we're good stewards. So, I mean, again, it was a more difficult budget process than we anticipated it would be because the Equalization Board prevented us from capturing that growth. But next year should be considerably easier. So I'm not concerned. I mean, we've got some big priorities, and we'll kind of hash those through with the public over the course of the next year and kind of take it from there. But absent any big new infrastructure investments, and I'm not saying we shouldn't make any. I mean, they may be called for either for public transit or for parks, for example. I don't see any looming. I mean, we're not sweeping anything under the rug. We're not eating the seed corn or raiding the rainy day fund. And this budget is a clean budget.
Awesome. Well, I want to move on to another piece of providing responsive and effective local government is the city website, which I think everybody would agree is in dire need of an overhaul.
And that was, one of many reasons I actually ran for mayor. It was just general disgust. It was a good metaphor for the state of affairs that things were in.
Right. So to that end, the city has announced a $1 million contract to upgrade the city website. And this contract, last I read, was with a company based in Brazil. Yeah. With all the investment Chattanooga is making towards being a tech hub, why was a local firm not chosen? And is $1 million really required for a website?
Well, working backwards, yes. I mean, again, there was an RFP. There's always an RFP. And anybody could respond to the RFP. And I think we had one local firm respond. And it frankly just wasn't close to the quality that we needed for a bolt-up redesign of a municipal website, right? I mean, we buy a bunch of police cars too, and they come from generally, Detroit, where Ford churns them out. I mean, we could probably hire somebody to build a car in a garage in Chattanooga. I mean, I am a localist. I mean, when we can find local vendors, we should use local vendors. But two things that are important to note about that. One, we're a low bid state. So, where something's commodified, we have to go with the low bidder. I disagree with that. I think we should be able to create a framework where we can quantify the value of recirculating local dollars. And let's say that's worth 20% more to use a local vendor. I mean, we're working on a policy that would withstand legal scrutiny to do that. In this case, it would be pretty simple, right? Could we pay 120% more for a local vendor who could produce the same quality website? There was no close second here in terms of the people who threw their hat in to do the work. So, I mean, look, I always, forever would rather use a local vendor. But in this case, there was not one that responded to the RFP that was in the same league in terms of what they're going to produce. And notably, in that same economic kind of framework, the value of the asset that will be produced is going to be, I think, much, much more economically and hopefully culturally valuable to the citizens of Chattanooga than the value that would have been derived by using a substandard local vendor.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to move on to the next goal, which is build a competitive regional economy. Yep. Just a broad question. Highlight some of the things your administration is doing to bring better jobs and higher wages to Chattanooga.
Well, I think the main thing is just working cheek by jowl with the Chamber of Commerce, literally just daily. I mean, Charles Wood, I work with him on a daily basis, quite literally. And Jermaine Freeman, who is my interim chief of staff, was my senior advisor for economic development, and that is how I spend a lot of my time. I was in New York for a solid week doing media tours, at the behest of the chamber to promote Chattanooga on a national scale. And we've got the results to show for it. We've got 500 new jobs just last year, 500 new jobs and over $50 million in capital investment. Most of the job growth created, 80% of my number here in the regional economy in the last 10 years has been among middle-income manufacturing, logistics, and lower-income service jobs. And, we've been the beneficiary of a ton of that. I've got a great relationship with the state ECD commissioner, Stuart McWhorter, and we've got some great announcements coming up. So I don't worry about that part. Mm-hmm. I mean, having been on the Chamber of Commerce board a couple of times and knowing it inside and out, that part is cranking right along. I think the issue, of course, is A, making sure that those are higher paying jobs, which we're very intent on, and two, making sure that all of Chattanooga can take advantage of those higher paying jobs, right? Because another huge goal of the administration is to help close the racial wealth gap and wealth gaps generally, right? And if we don't create an educational system that can train the workforce needed to do those higher paid jobs, then hell, we may make things worse. So that's where I have a really good partner in Mayor Wamp. We don't see eye to eye on everything, but we see completely eye to eye on this one, and work really closely hand in glove on school-related and workforce development issues. Mm-hmm. And again, there's not any one thing I do here that's more important than that.
Great. Well, one thing when it comes to growing the regional economy, it seems that we've been trying to sell ourselves as a tech hub for, I think it was more than a decade ago that we announced the gig city. And it seems like the actual job creation from that has been lagging the kind of cheerleading that has been happening for a long time. There are some, notable exceptions to that. Yep. But it seems to a lot of people that little progress has actually been made in terms of attracting larger companies without extending large tax breaks. Yeah. How do you see the future of Chattanooga's economy do we continue to try and ride this wave of being a tech hub, or take things in another direction, or a little bit of both?
Well, I think Chattanooga has always been best being the best version of itself. And the question, of course, is what is that, right? I hear that again. I mean, I remember Gary Vaynerchuk said that to me and a lot of other people, 10, 15 years ago, right? Like, don't try to be LA. And there is a part here that, that's always saying, we're going to attract, Twitter's headquarters here.
We're going to be the next Silicon Valley.
I mean, well, but here's the thing. The pandemic changed everything fundamentally. And what we've found is that we have a long tail of talent that is granular, that has showed up here for the quality of life. And if the work from home movement is here to stay, and I think it is, at least to an extent, and quality of life is the coin of the realm, where talent can live anywhere it wants, then that really is probably Chattanooga's greatest opportunity. Now, that said, we're not going to give up on traditional company relocations. I think a lot of what we've been working on behind the scenes on airport reform is key to that. I mean, we've been working very, very hard behind the scenes. A lot of what you see through the airport authority, which is independent, happens because, frankly, we make phone calls and we appoint those board members, and there is real urgency behind getting better air service here. I think that's the last remaining obstacle to a company taking us seriously, because many of them, frankly, don't right now without better air service. And you got Nashville right up the road, and you got Atlanta just down the road. The other really interesting thing that I would, again, challenging the premise a little bit, Charles Wood is quite vocal about this. Knoxville, just for example, just made a $400,000 cash grant to a software development center, and $150,000 from the county. We haven't done anything like that in Chattanooga ever. Memphis just gave a $2.3 million cash grant to ServiceMaster to expand. And Nashville, again, this is not like this is organic growth. Just gave a 20-year pilot to the Bridgestone headquarters project, and $3,500 cash per job to expand, right? And that apparently is their number. Phillips is coming in there. They're paying $3,500 per job, cash, $500 per year over 7 years. And we're not doing things like that here. We could use the Industrial Development Board to do things like that, but I get really annoyed and frustrated when this narrative is like we're giving away the farm doing TIFs and pilots, when we are not. We're actually going to a gunfight with a bit of a butter knife, because we're not giving away the farm, right? That said, right, I do think I consider my job to be kind of a Goldilocks problem. I probably said that to you in the last interview we did, because I'm not looking to just give away the farm and have this torrid growth. I think we're on a really good trajectory, right? Growing just fast enough to be able to fund city government and not have terrible congestion and traffic issues, but not slowing down to where we're, where we're just in a state of torpor.
Right. So one of the downstream effects of all of this growth that we're talking about, especially when you talk about kind of that talent pool that can work from anywhere, is an issue when it comes to affordable housing.
Yeah.
So all of these things end up getting tied together.
Yeah.
Your administration has announced a lot of programs related to affordable housing. I was hoping you could just briefly summarize some of those.
Well, I think you're probably going to talk to Nicole Heyman at some point, and you should, because she's brilliant. She was a great get, again, back to the talent acquisition piece from the city of New Orleans. And she is a rock star, and she is hard at work compiling the data we need to really know the landscape, working with a group called the Reinvestment Fund and HRNA and RCLCO and others to make sure we understand the ecosystem before we start trying to do surgery and applying tools. But we will have that action plan very, very soon. And meanwhile, that will then inform how we spend the $100 million that we pledged to raise for this problem. We've already got 600 plus units already scheduled to become available over the next 2 years. I think what you're going to see is us working hard to make sure we get our fair share of LIHTC dollars, which we absolutely have not in the past. And that's not necessarily anybody's fault. We weren't really ready. We didn't have developers who were interested in it, but and this is getting into the weeds with housing geekery. But LIHTC is a hugely important primary tool for affordable housing development, and we've done very little here lately. So again, you'll see some news here probably maybe before this goes to air, but you will be very impressed with her when you talk to her. I will say too, last thing, I've seen a lot of reports over the last month around this to inform this work. And the rise in home prices here cannot be explained simply by the rise in population growth. I do think that runaway short-term vacation rental speculation had a lot to do with that. I think I think what you had. I mean, our old STVR regs were lousy and they were unenforced and unenforceable. And the new regs will be much, much better. And I think we've already seen people stop buying things on spec because, again, you can put something on Airbnb and cash flow 3 or 4 times what you could on a monthly rental. And I think that was happening a lot more. And then, of course, what you've done is ratchet up the comp on that house for other houses. And so I think that had a lot more to do with it than we realize now. We're using a company called Ptolemy now to disaggregate that data, and we will know more. But I think that had something to do with it, and that if it hasn't already stopped, it'll be stopping soon.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that ratcheting up the comp part of that puzzle, because there's not actually that many short-term vacation rentals as a percentage of how many houses we have from the reports I've seen, but those comps start getting jacked up by all of these speculators.
Well, and again, a lot of them...
That has a huge downstream effect. So it's more than just the percentage.
It is. There's no question about it. And again, you got to remember, too, that every one of those things that goes on Airbnb comes off the market for monthly rental, which then increases the pressure on rental. Now, in some cities across the country, you have literally lots of illegal stuff going on where... people have, by disaggregating the data, and I'm not saying this is happening in Chattanooga. It absolutely happened in, for example, Kansas City, where you had big private equity groups coming in, kind of, we'll just call them large landlords, buying up large contiguous chunks of property and then colluding on rental prices. I hope they go to jail for it. They should. I'm not saying that happened here, but we'll know soon because we're
there's an
pulling the data
ongoing
to find
lawsuit.
it. Yeah,
mostly Nashville-based, I think, from last I read, but it's a Tennessee lawsuit.
Yep. Well,
so it could hit here.
That's part of the problem.
I do want to keep moving on a little bit and talk about homelessness. Your administration claims a 40% reduction in unsheltered people in Hamilton County since last year. Point in time counts, so there's some fuzziness around those, obviously. Some people are skeptical about these counts, and I've even seen some suggestions, strikes me as a little extreme, but some suggestions that the reduction is simply due to deaths in the homeless community.
Yeah.
So can you just clarify how your administration arrived at this 40% number? And
well, again, we didn't claim this. I mean, this is not. I mean, frankly, I was a little skeptical when I saw the numbers. That we don't do the freaking count. It's not. This is not. I mean, this was my problem internally with this whole thing when it came out. I mean, I knew there would be skepticism because the drop was so large, but this is not something we cooked up. The HUD requires every city to go do a point in time count. There's a very, very specific methodology, and they came in and said, "Holy shit! Guess what? Here are the numbers. We didn't gin the numbers up. I mean, the numbers were the numbers." I was, pleasantly surprised that it reflected a lot of the hard work that we'd been doing, and we can talk about what that work was. But again, I take particular exception to the idea that this is just some kind of propaganda that we ginned up. I mean, we weren't looking for this, but it was remarkable in its face and obvious on its face. And, HUD noticed, a lot of people noticed and said, "Holy mackerel, what are you doing there?" But it was not something we internally at the mayor's office were like, we need to go, we were just going to cook up some numbers. And the idea that somehow it's due to deaths is just insulting and ridiculous. It's just crazy. So, no, I mean, the process for doing a point in time count is very well documented. Right. And internally, right, I mean, we arguably didn't do a great job of communicating all of this externally because that was my big issue to begin with. Is I knew people would be skeptical, but this was not, internally generated. I mean, it was something that the Regional Homeless Coalition, did and said, hey, look, clearly this is working. So, I mean, we're proud. I mean, we worked really, really, really hard to address homelessness, including changing horses with the lead agency to the Homeless Coalition, bringing in multiple partners and just saying, look, you guys have got to work together to solve this problem, bringing in landlords to say, hey, we'll guarantee first months in security if you'll give these people a chance. All of that, right? If there's, I think, the reason there was, and I drive this every day, right? Because the main pod, but not the only pod of kind of unsheltered people is up near the community kitchen. And I live in Fort Wood, so I drive it to City Hall on purpose, every day to and from work. And so I have kind of a thumbnail barometer of what's going on. And I will say, I think a lot of the skepticism stems from the fact that, frankly, the people that we were able to get housed were what you would consider to be the low-hanging fruit. They were the people that were ready to be housed. Right. The people that we still really need housing are the worst cases, are the people with persistent mental illness and the people that need permanent supportive housing. And those projects, frustratingly, have taken a hell of a lot longer to come together. Both the Ames Sparrow project and the Airport Inn project. And so when those get stood up and will represent, another probably 300 units of permanent supportive housing, then we will really have made a dent in the toughest part of the population.
Right. So I hate to move on because I would like to talk about that more, but I will hopefully be following up with several of your cabinet members and having some more in the weeds type interviews about these sorts of things. So for all of our listeners, we'll get there. So I want to move on to the next goal in the One Chattanooga plan, which is improve local infrastructure and public transit. Your administration has been putting a lot of focus on deferred road maintenance, I think more than tripling the budget, if I remember correctly. Can you summarize the progress that has been made so far? Are there any upcoming projects that you would like to highlight? I know we talked about the Walnut Street Bridge, and I think you might have mentioned the Wilcox Boulevard Bridge, but any other?
Well, again, it all just seems like boiling the ocean at this point, right? I mean, it's all just kind of drops in the bucket because, what we came to realize is that even though we tripled the budget, and we last year paved 63 lane miles, 40,000 potholes. 40,000 potholes. Again, the big issue there is we assume that everybody agrees on what a pothole is, and of course, a lot of times when you run over a manhole cover that's not sunken correctly, or a road failure, right? It's like, I went over a bump. That must be a pothole. Not a pothole. They can't pave that. But those are. But even still, right? We have a massive amount to catch up on, and then there's a element of civility and professional courtesy that's still alive in local government. So I'm not here to drag my predecessors, but we were way behind. And I mean, there's some graphics we could supply you to show you this, but we should have been spending the $10 million just to stay even. And there's an element of urban planning that if we make it harder for people to drive, then everybody will just hop on a bike, right? And I do not agree. I'm super pro bike, super pro pedestrian, and we can talk about urban planning strategies later. But for crying out loud, right? We have to keep up with our main thoroughfares, and we just fell so far behind. So, and then of course inflation hasn't helped that either. But gun barrels next. I think June 1st that'll be done. We've already gotten a lot of calls saying thank you for that. Bailey, McCauley, Davidson Road all got paved. Dodds Avenue's coming up. Holtzclaw is coming up, which is close to my house, and I'm particularly excited about. But again, we've changed this fundamentally in that we've, again, transparency and accountability are a big part of the administration. So anybody can go to cha.city/paving map and see what's next. So
good.
And if we find extra money, I mean, again, we need to do more than just keep up. So, we'll be sweeping any extra capital budget we can find towards projects like this. And we can also talk about, sidewalks and bike lanes and all that. But it's just, we are playing a massive game of catch up.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things I have noticed both in gathering questions for this interview and just generally spending time on social media, whenever a paving project gets announced, the question is always, well, why not this other road?
Yeah, well,
and so it's just part of living in a city. Like, you've got to prioritize.
Well, I'll give you an example. I just had a room full of people in here from Elder Mountain. Elder Mountain has a handful of houses, and it'd be a really good podcast to unpack the history. I understand it's somewhat sordid. It would cost $1.5 million, 15% of the entire paving budget to repave Elder Mountain Road for the benefit of the 30 houses at the top, a handful of which actually pay city taxes. And somebody's going to have to repave that road at some point. Mm-hmm. But I have to look at that in the context of the 500 square miles of the city.
Right.
And there's just not an easy answer, right? I mean, again, if you're one of the people that lives up there, you don't care. But this is what happens when you don't keep up with capital expenditures in the way that you should.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to move on a little bit and talk about kind of the flip side of infrastructure spending, pedestrian and cyclist facilities, especially in light of the recently adopted Climate Action Plan. Yep. And also, there's been an increase in year-to-date pedestrian and cyclist-involved crashes.
Yes.
I don't have the exact percentage on me, but just wondering what is being done to improve safety for pedestrians and cyclists, and not just safety, but to encourage people to walk and to bike in recognition of these climate goals.
Yes, well, we've got a lot happening there. We happen to have a lot of folks in planning who are quite passionate about this in their personal lives, and so there's no shortage of shall we say, focused attention on the issue. But part of it, just goes back to budget, right? Again, this is somewhat ironic. It comes on the tails of the conversation about road spending, because which is it, and there's a limited pot, but a lot of the stuff around pedestrian and bike safety, I think, has more to do with wise planning. I think, for example, I ride my bike from home quite a lot, and we've got bike lanes in places where there isn't room for bikes, and it's horrifying, right? And we fell victim to a pretty dumb thing by taking federal dollars to expand roads, and they'll give you they would plus up the match if you included a bike lane. Well, so we got a bunch of bike lanes to nowhere, because when we paved this road, we would put a bike lane in, but there's no. So or
they're just kind of the leftovers.
Yeah, and I've
road width.
Right, and my challenge to the city planning team and the RPA is to create more of a logical, contiguous bike lane route from the areas where people, where the demand is, right? I mean, we ask for, neighborhood input before we put in speed bumps and things like that. Why wouldn't we be prioritizing the areas where people want to be able to ride? And those aren't tough to figure out, right? Demographically, psychographically, or otherwise. So, I think that's where the focus is. And I think, it is going to be more of a planning priority now. We do have some grant money that's available, and that will help. But I think we've got 155 miles of new bike lanes that were created as of 2022. I think that's a year-to-date figure, but again, the stringing them all together is the tough one. The sidewalk repair piece, our annual goal is 20,000 square feet plus. But again, we're just way far behind, I think. And then finally, I think the enforcement piece of this is also really important. Main Street in particular. I mean, I spend a lot of time up and down Main Street, and the speeding, and we saw a lot of weird, psychological sort of behaviors on the backside of COVID. I mean, you saw it the way that airplane passengers were behaving, litter being thrown out car windows, and speeding. Right, just this kind of reckless abandon and behavior, and so enforcement's going to have to be part of this until people kind of get their heads back together. Mm-hmm. So I'm, and it will be right. We've had multiple meetings with CPD about increased enforcement in pedestrian heavy areas like Maine, and that will continue to happen.
So I want to move on and talk about CARTA very quickly.
Yep.
A couple just follow-ups. In your campaign, you said you were exploring making CARTA free on select routes. I know there's been a lot of changes in CARTA. You nominated almost an entirely new board.
Yeah.
So, some of this might just be working itself out. But where do ideas like that stand, and what else is being done to improve public transit in Chattanooga?
Yes. Well, that is kind of how it, one of the more surprising things about this job when I got here was that there are certain city entities that either were city entities like the airport, but are now independent authorities. CARTA is one of them, right, where you don't really have any direct control as mayor. It's not like calling up Public Works and saying, hey, man, get it together or do this or do that, right? This is one where you really have to kind of use frankly, the bully pulpit and board appointments to get what you want. And that was, again, we've got some really sharp new board members at CARTA with a very, very clear charge and mission. And that is to take advantage of this, what I think is kind of an unprecedented, overused term, but inflection point in time where we are with, technology, with, again, Chattanooga's, we don't have a ton of investments in legacy infrastructure, and, having a city RPA or a city planning head in Dan Reuter, who is very transit oriented, to kind of reimagine what public transit looks like and really kind of scrub the decks and start over. So, for example, as you probably know, you can't get on a CARTA bus unless you have exact change if you don't have a fare card. No wonder we don't have higher ridership levels, right? So, this is really going to be back to the basics, right, and starting with fare boxes that are more friendly. In a perfect world, you can get on and tap your phone like you can to get on the New York City subway. And then thinking with new technology partners like VIA, how public transit can work better for everybody, how it can be more accessible, how it can extend down to micromobility, and things like scooters and bikes. And but this is going to be a very important year for CARTA in terms of planning and transition. And I'm going to let them do their thing, and we'll start back from there. I'm still committed to the fare-free thing. I do think I think the way that is likely to march out, based on what the research I've done in terms of best practices, is fare-free by need, right? Like, so students, for example, in many cities in the country can travel fare-free on various transit lines, and that's where I see it going. Because you can issue a card, put credits on that card, right, and make it effectively fare-free.
Right. And then one last question, the infrastructure piece. In our first interview, I asked what's one thing you were completely confident you could get done, and you said you would retime the traffic lights.
Yeah.
Is that still a goal? And if so, what is the timeline on that?
It is absolutely still a goal. I'm reminded of that, famous Mike Tyson quote that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the nose. And in this case, boy, howdy, city government. And, it's really not city government as much as it is with every layer of complexity. And this in your day job, right? You get to the state, things get slower. You get to the federal government, things slow to a crawl. So sounds easy to retime traffic lights. And we are playing around with things at the margins. I think I know some people have called me and said 4th Street seems to be better, right? Being able to roll with the lights from from the off ramp all the way up to like the roundhouse. It's getting better here and there, but we've got there's like 300 plus intersections, and so doing it at scale requires a deep dive. And we won a federal grant back in 2021 that is still slowly moving through the funding release process. And, God willing, we can get a vendor selected this year and roll from there. Mm-hmm. But we were, once again, I think my first week in the office, that was like one of the first meetings we had. And I was told that best practice is to retime traffic lights every, 3 or 4 years. And we hadn't done it in 8. And it's going to be another 2 plus. So once again, digging out, but it absolutely remains a goal. And if it's the last damn thing I do, we will do it.
Well, how much time do we have left? I know you've got other meetings
got a couple minutes. Yeah.
So move through these real quickly.
Yeah.
They deserve more time, but unfortunately we don't have it. One of your other goals is catalyzing economic vitality in the Black community.
Yeah.
You touched on this briefly in one of the earlier questions, but just how is this being measured, and highlight a couple things that you're particularly interested in.
So, again, I've said this before, say it again. That now this would be news to you, but the more time I've spent in this job, the more I realize that really is the central, most important thing I can do that solves the most other problems from there. We're lucky to be part of a program that the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank and the National League of Cities puts on called the Southern Cities for Economic Inclusion. And that's the work. I was just in New Orleans for 3 days last week, working on this with those other cohorts around the South, which all share these similar challenges. And we learned some great things. We got a lot. We're going to be taking a field trip to the city of Savannah that's doing a lot of stuff that we can learn from, just as one example. But back to the KPIs, right? It's median income, it's net worth, it's home ownership. Those are the simple ones.
Mm-hmm. So moving on,
yeah.
Next goal is closing gaps in public health. Again, just briefly highlight a couple of accomplishments there. And then also if you could talk briefly about the mental health co-response unit with CPD. I haven't heard much news about that since it was originally announced.
Yeah. Well, the public health aspect was obviously novel, right? We brought that in, and it was during COVID, and that's where the bulk of the work was originally. But obviously, we all remember the terrible shooting that happened, and we are haunted by that on a daily basis around here. And the gun violence prevention efforts that we put together are living under community health, and because we do see that as a public health crisis. And very frankly, we were part of a Bloomberg innovation cohort where that's the goal that the cohort here at the city chose, was youth gun violence prevention, and they've made a lot of progress in that regard. And guess what the punchline is? It gets back to mental health and mentorship for young men who are on the margins and in trouble, right? So that work continues, and I think what you'll see is that community health will continue to focus on mental health and the social determinants of health, and we will update the Chattanooga plan soon, and that will be probably one of the more significant updates because that department will really be sharpening its focus there. Second question was the co-response unit. Yeah, it's happening. I'm pretty sure there were positions that are in the budget this year to expand that, and so we're committed to that. It's been working extremely well, and we're going to continue to expand it.
Awesome. And then last goal is build a universal path to early learning.
Yep.
Again, just highlight a couple things.
Well, we were frankly hopeful and frankly disappointed that got carved out of Build Back Better and a lot of the federal infrastructure dollars, because we're one of the only countries in the OECD world and the advanced economies that does not have some form of expanded early childhood access. It's just a very, very clear best practice in industrial, in the whole world, not just the industrial world. But we have managed to raise the pay for our Head Start teachers. We created 275 new early learning seats with ARP funds. Again, it's an expensive enterprise. Part of the issue as well is just the supply of people to do the work. And Caritza Mosley Jones, who is a city employee and a school board member, to her infinite credit, had the idea to create a new Future Ready Institute at Tyner for early care and learning. And I think that will kick off this fall, but that will help create a pipeline of early childhood suppliers who themselves, workers, may very well become entrepreneurs and start their own centers. And the hope is that will kind of kick off some organic growth in the child care market, which is largely still a kind of a disorganized small business market.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, any closing remarks?
No, not at all. Again, it's I'm not bored. Again, it is a grind, but I'm on about my fourth year of unfaithfully reading the Daily Stoic on not a daily basis, but that book has always kind of helped me get through. And it's odd. This morning's entry was about the meaning of life, being about meaningful work, and God knows that's what this is, right? It's there are good days and bad days, but I really, really believe fundamentally that Chattanooga is an extraordinary city, and that its best days are ahead of it, right? And so helping to be part of that and pushing the multiple rocks up multiple hills is it's exhausting, but it's fun, and it's it's good to see progress.
Great. Well, thank you, Mayor Kelly, so much for your time.
Thank you, Nathan.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chattanooga Civics. Our music was written and recorded by Kevin MacLeod. If you have any questions or feedback, please send me an email at chattanoogacivics@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @ChatCivics, or visit the website ChattanoogaCivics.com. Thanks for listening.